Hi, everybody. I think we're going to get started here. Still sorting a few folks out online, but I think we've got enough to get the meeting started here. So welcome, everybody, to the American Lobster Management Board. We had an agenda that was published, so I'm going to start with that. Are there any changes or additions or anything else to the agenda that we'd like for today? Yes, Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under other business, I'd like to, after we finish with the addendum issues, I'd like to raise an issue around Canada. And then a second issue would be the northern edge that the council has just taken up.
Thank you, Pat. Any other changes to the agenda? Yes, Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure it's a change to the agenda, but when you get into the action items, I would like to take certain aspects of addendum 27 out of order. Is that something we can deal with when we get to that item?
Yes, thanks, Dan. I was actually thinking the same exact thing, so I will be sure to highlight that. Thank you. Okay, any other changes to the agenda? All right, so we've had two additions under other business. Not seeing any other changes to the agenda. Look to approve the agenda as modified. Are there any objections to approving the agenda as modified? Not seeing any, we'll consider the agenda approved. Thanks, everybody. Next, we'll move to the proceedings from the January 2023 meeting. Are there any changes, additions, deletions to those proceedings from anybody on the board? Okay, not seeing any hands around the table. Caitlin, anybody online with a hand up? Okay, with that, are there any objections to approving the proceedings as submitted? Please raise your hand. Seeing none, we will consider the proceedings approved. Thanks, everybody. Okay, let's see. The next agenda item is for public comment. This is public comment for things that are not currently on the agenda. Is there anyone from the public that wishes to make a comment on something, again, that we're not already covering on today's agenda? So I'm looking around the room here first, not seeing anyone. Looking over at Caitlin, nobody online either. So we will consider there to be no additional public comment. I will come back to public comment in a few moments here, but we'll move past that item for now. So next up is the main event. We're going to consider addendum 27 on increasing protection of spawning stock biomass of the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stock for final approval. So we're going to have a presentation from Caitlin Starks, both on the addendum itself as well as the advisory panel report. And then we'll come back. And then I wanted to offer a couple of comments. Dan McKiernan mentioned one of them, but I'll hit that stuff after the presentations and after you've cleared up any questions that you have. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Caitlin, to take us through the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll be giving a pretty quick, hopefully, presentation on draft addendum 27 itself, which is again on increasing protection of the spawning stock in the Georges Bank and Gulf of Maine stock. I'll start off today with some brief background. So the addendum timeline, background information on the draft addendum, and then go over the proposed management options that are in the document. And then after that, I'll summarize the public comments on this addendum and present the AP report. And then we'll wrap up with the board's actions for consideration today. So this addendum was originally initiated in 2017, and then work on the addendum was paused for several years as the board had to prioritize work on right whale risk reduction efforts. And then work on this addendum was restarted in February of 2021. And in 2021 and 2022, the plan development team developed this draft addendum document with guidance from the management board. And in January of 2023, the board approved the draft addendum for public comment. Our public comment period occurred earlier this year from March to April 8th of 2023. And during that time, we had 8 hearings that were held from Maine to New York. And today the board will consider selecting a management program and final approval of draft addendum 27. So as I mentioned, the board originally initiated draft addendum 27 in August of 2017, and this was in response to concerns about decreasing trends in larval settlement indices for the Gulf of Maine, which have been showing declines since about 2012. At that time, the addendum was focused on standardizing management measures across the lobster conservation and management areas, or LCMAs, within the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stock. And then in 2021, after the board received the results of the 2020 stock assessment and reinitiated work on this addendum, the 2020 stock assessment highlighted some continued negative trends in the lobster stock indices in the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank. In the last 5 years, settlement surveys have remained below the 75th percentile of their time series. And since the 2020 stock assessment was completed, which only included data through 2018, we've also seen some declines in the recruit abundance indices in the ventless trap survey and trawl surveys for the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank. So to give a visual of this, this slide shows the Gulf of Maine young of year survey indices through 2021, shows our last year of data that we have. And the last 3 years of data are shown in red. And you can see that there's been an overall downward trend in the settlement indices over about the past decade, with only one of the survey areas showing an increase in the last 3 years. And then this figure shows the Gulf of Maine recruit abundance indices from the trawl survey through 2021. Again, the last 3 years of data are shown in red. And you can see here that after it increased for a while in the 2000s and 2010s, the recruits have also started to show declines in the last 2 or 3 years in most of the survey areas. So with these trends in mind, the board revised the objective for this addendum, and it is now this shown on the screen. Given persistent low settlement indices and recent decreases in recruit indices, the addendum should consider a trigger mechanism such that upon reaching the trigger, measures would be automatically implemented to increase the overall protection of spawning stock biomass of the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stock. The draft addendum also considers some options that would standardize some of the existing management measures within the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock, which are aimed at improving or resolving some of the discrepancies between measures in different management areas within the stock. And the proposed options are expected to have benefits for the stock assessment, as well as law enforcement and interstate commerce. Okay, so next I'm going to go over the proposed options that were included in the draft addendum for public comment. So our proposed options in draft addendum 27 are separated into 2 issues. Issue 1 addresses the standardization of a subset of management measures within LCMAs and across the stock. And then issue 2 considers implementing biological management measures that are expected to provide increased protection of the spawning stock biomass. Before I go into the proposed changes, I want to review the relevant current measures for the areas within the stock. These are Area 1, Area 3, and Outer Cape Cod, just to make sure everyone is on the same page for what are the measures that were considered in the status quo options. So the Area 1 minimum gauge size is currently 3 1/4 inch. Area 3 is slightly larger at 3 inches and 17/32 of an inch, and Outer Cape is at 3 3/8 of an inch. V-notching is required in Area 1 and in Area 3 above the latitude of 42 degrees and 30 seconds, and then Outer Cape Cod does not have mandatory V-notching. In Area 1, there is a 0 tolerance definition for possession of V-notched lobster, and in Area 3, the definition is a notch that's 1/8 of an inch deep with or without cedal hairs. And in Outer Cape Cod, there are 2 definitions. So for state permitted fishermen in state waters, the definition is 1/4 of an inch without cedal hairs. And for federal permit holders, regardless of location, the definition is 1/8 of an inch with or without cedal hairs. And then for maximum gauge sizes, LCMA 1 is at 5 inches, LCMA 3 is at 6 3/4 of an inch, and Outer Cape Cod, there are two maximum sizes. For state waters, there's no maximum size, and in federal waters, it is 6 3/4 of an inch. So the options under issue 1 are status quo, or which is A, or B, which would implement some standardized measures upon final approval of this addendum. And under option B, there are 4 sub-options that would define what those standardized measures would include. And from the 4 sub-options, the board can select as many as desired depending on which issues it wants to address. So these are the 4 sub-options under B. B1 would implement standardized measures within the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock LCMAs if there's a discrepancy within one LCMA to the most conservative measure where there are inconsistencies. So this would result in the maximum gauge size in Outer Cape Cod going to 6 3/4 of an inch for both state and federal permit holders. And it would result in a V-notch possession definition of 1/8 inch with or without cedal hairs. Option B2 would standardize the V-notch requirement across LCMAs such that V-notching would be mandatory for all eggers in LCMAs 1, 3, and Outer Cape Cod. And option B3 is to standardize the V-notch possession definition to 1/8 of an inch with or without cedal hairs for LCMA 1, 3, and Outer Cape Cod. And then option B4 would standardize the regulations across the LCMAs to limit the issuance of trap tags to equal the harvester trap tag allocation. So this means that no surplus tags would be automatically issued until trap losses occur and are documented. So moving on to issue 2, these options focus on implementing management measures that would increase the protection of the spawning stock biomass. And the options consider changes to the minimum and maximum gauge sizes, as well as corresponding escape fence sizes. And these are expected to increase the spawning stock biomass and allow more lobsters to reproduce before they're harvested by the fishery. So including our status quo option, there are 3 total options under issue 2. Within the options, there are 2 approaches for implementing management changes. The first approach is what is included in option B, and this would establish a trigger mechanism such that when a trigger is reached, it would result in predetermined management measures being implemented, and the trigger would be based on a certain amount of decline in an index, and I'll go into that in a moment. And the proposed trigger index that would be used is based on multiple recruit abundance indices that are averaged over 3 years. And then the second approach that we have is applied in option C, and this would establish a predetermined schedule for future changes to the management measures. So under option B, the board would establish a trigger mechanism to implement predetermined management measures when the trigger is reached. And in this option, that means the board would need to define what the trigger level is and what management measures would be implemented when that trigger is reached. So for selecting a trigger level, we have 2 options. Trigger option 1 is that if the trigger index declines from its reference level by 32%, that would trigger the implementation of the management measures that are selected by the board. And then trigger option 2 is a 45% decline in the trigger index. And just as a reminder, these 2 trigger levels are meant to approximate similar declines in lobster abundance. So our 45% trigger approximates the 75th percentile of the moderate abundance regime from the stock assessment. And this figure is showing the trigger index that would be used under option B to determine when the management measures would be implemented. This is calculated through 2021 with the available data. And the top left panel shows the combined index that would be used to determine when the trigger level is reached. And then the 3 survey indices that go into that combined index are shown individually in the other 3 panels. These are the fall and spring trawl survey recruit indices and the ventless trap recruit index. The 2 horizontal lines on each graph represent the proposed trigger levels of 32% and 45%. So the reference level that the index is compared to is based on the reference abundance time frame from the stock assessment, which was 2016 through 2018. So the index is scaled to that reference level. So on the y-axis, 1 represents the reference level, and that's the 2016 to 2018 average of the indices that go into the index. And then as the index values change over time, depending on additional years of survey data, they'll either decline below 1 or increase above 1. And our most recent index value, which is the 3-year average from 2019 to 2021, is 0.765, and that is about a 23% decline from the reference value. So if option B is selected, the board would also need to select the biological management measures that would be automatically implemented in the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock when that trigger level is reached. And we have 2 options for management measures that were proposed in the addendum. So measures option 1 would change the minimum and maximum gauge sizes and the escape vent sizes in a single year. And then measures option 2 would involve a series of gradual changes to the gauge and escape vent sizes over several years. Again, these are the current gauge and vent sizes in the management areas in the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock. And this table shows the measures that would change under measures option 1, and the changes from status quo are shown in bold. So under measures option 1, when the established trigger level is reached for the following fishing year, the minimum gauge size for LCMA 1 would increase from the current size to 3 3/8 of an inch. The escape vent size in LCMA 1 would be adjusted corresponding with that minimum gauge size change, and the maximum gauge size in LCMA 3 and Outer Cape Cod would decrease to 6 inches. The proposed increase to the minimum gauge size in LCMA 1 is expected to increase the proportion of the population that's able to reproduce before harvested by the fishery. And this is expected to have a short-term negative impact on the Area 1 harvest, but over time, the harvest and weight is expected to increase slightly with the minimum gauge size increase. The proposed decrease to the maximum gauge sizes in LCMA 3 and Outer Cape Cod are expected to enhance the stock's resiliency by placing forever protections on a small proportion of the population, which includes the larger lobsters of both sexes. And that change would be expected to have a small negative impact on the harvest number and weight. And the proposed combinations of gauge and vent sizes are expected to maintain similar retention rates of legal size lobsters and protection of sublegal sizes. The vent size that's proposed for Area 1 here is also consistent with the current vent size that is used in the southern New England management areas, where the minimum gauge size is also 3 3/8 of an inch. Right, and then this next table lists the management measures that would be implemented if measures option 2 is selected when the trigger point is reached. And again, the changes in each of the years are shown in bold. I want to note here that these final measures in this option in the last row are the same as what you saw in the previous option. The difference is just that these changes occur gradually as opposed to all at once. So under measures option 2, when the trigger level is reached, it would start a series of gradual changes in gauge sizes for the areas in the stock, and the changes would occur every other year. And the minimum gauge size in Area 1 would increase twice in increments of 1/16 of an inch, and the maximum gauge size for Area 3 and the Outer Cape Cod area would decrease twice in increments of 1/4 of an inch. The escape vent size in LCMA 1 would be adjusted a single time when the final minimum gauge size is implemented in that area. And then the last option under issue 2 is option C, and this considers implementing gradual changes to the gauge and escape vent sizes on an established schedule as opposed to using a trigger mechanism. So there are 3 steps for proposed changes in this option. This table shows the measures that would change in each of those steps in bold font. And the first set of measures would be implemented no later than the 2026 fishing year. And in the first step, there would be an increase in the minimum gauge size in Area 1 by 1/16 of an inch to 3 5/16 of an inch, and a decrease in the maximum gauge size in LCMA 3 and Outer Cape Cod to 6.5 inches. And then 1 year following that, there would be a decrease to the maximum gauge size in LCMA 3 and Outer Cape Cod to 6 1/4 inches, and no change in LMA 1 in that year. And then in the third and final step, which would occur 1 year later, it would increase the minimum gauge size in LMA 1 to 3 3/8 of an inch, and decrease the maximum gauge sizes for LMA 3 and Outer Cape Cod to 6 inches. And the vent size in LMA 1 would also be adjusted in that third and final step. And as a note, for any of the proposed options for LCMA 3 measures, the addendum specifies that whatever measures are selected would apply to all of Area 3 permit holders, including those that fish in the southern New England stock. All right, so that covers all of the options in the draft addendum, and I'm now going to go over the public comment summary. So our public comment period started in early March and ended on April 8th. And during that time, we had 8 public hearings that were held for Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York. 4 of those hearings were in person and 4 were held virtually. And across the 8 hearings, there were 214 public attendees. There might be some overlap in the individuals who attended multiple hearings. But in total, during the comment period, we received 67 written public comments. 6 of those were letters from organizations. These tables show the breakdown of the public hearing attendees and the number of comments that were provided at each of the hearings, which totaled to 159 comments provided within the public hearings, and then the breakdown of the written comments as well. And then this larger table, I know it might be a bit hard to see, but I wanted to break down the number of comments that were in support of each option. So each of the options or sub-options that are included in the addendum are shown in separate rows of this table. And in the far right column are the total comments that were in support of each of those options. So the takeaway here is that the majority of comments were in support of status quo. But there were a number of comments that supported one or more of the other options. And I will go into the reasons behind the support for each of those in the next slides. So across the comments that we received, there were a few themes that were repeated by a significant number of people. One of these is that there was a lot of concern about the economic impacts that could result from increasing the minimum size in Area 1, while still allowing imports of Canadian lobster that are smaller than the US minimum size. Within the comments that addressed the options for V-notching, there were a significant number of folks that supported standardizing the V-notch definition. However, it did seem that there was a preference among those individuals to go to a 0 tolerance definition rather than 1/8 of an inch with or without cedal hairs, because they didn't want to move backwards from the 0 tolerance definition in Area 1. So regarding the proposed changes to the gauge sizes, a majority of the comments about this issue expressed a preference for smaller gradual changes to the measures as opposed to implementing all of the changes at once. And then there were a lot of comments submitted specifically about the proposed changes for the Outer Cape Cod management area. And in these comments, people spoke about the unique situation of the Outer Cape fishery and felt that it was not adequately considered in the addendum options. In the comments that expressed a preference for status quo under issue 1, which is to not standardize any of the management measures across or within LCMAs, a number of people were concerned that the proposed changes would hurt the lobster industry and lobster population. Specifically, they referred to the increased restrictions that would go on to the commercial harvest and the financial strain that would be caused by needing to replace or update their gear to meet the new requirements. There were also many comments that said they were in support of the status quo option because the current measures are working and they don't need to be changed. And they also thought that the proposed options for standardizing measures were not really for the benefit of the stock, but rather for the benefit of law enforcement. In the comments that supported some parts of option B under issue 1 to standardize some measures, there were a good number that felt that standardizing and increasing the strictness of V-notch requirements across the LCMAs would have benefits to the stock. Some people noted that it's a problem that lobsters that must be thrown back in one area can just be harvested in an adjacent area. And one comment supported sub-option B4, which would limit the trap tag issuance to the harvester allocation unless losses are documented, because they felt that this would help reduce the issue of lost and derelict gear. Among the comments that were in support of status quo under issue 2, so that would not implement any management changes to the biological management measures to increase spawning stock protection. A lot of these comments cited market or economic concerns, and many specifically mentioned the concern about Canada gaining a market advantage over the US fishery if the LCMA1 minimum gauge size is increased. And as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of comments in favor of status quo came from fishermen in the Outer Cape cod management area. And their comments expressed that because of its unique situation, the Outer Cape would be disproportionately harmed by the proposed gauge size changes. They mentioned that Outer Cape has a unique catch demographics as well as a niche market for large lobster, and that also because of the cost of living in the area, which is relatively higher than in other areas, they would face more economic hardship due to the changes than other areas would. And then in the handful of comments that were in support of the trigger approach for implementing management changes under issue 2, there was a majority preference for gradual changes over a single change. Supporters of option B felt that the proposed changes would increase the overall health of the stock, that it could bring higher quality product to market and fetch higher prices and provide more value to the marketplace. Some comments mentioned that they supported a minimum gauge size increase over the maximum size decreases that are proposed because of the greater overall positive impact it is expected to have on the stock. And it was also noted that decreasing the maximum gauge would result in a permanent loss of landings, but increasing the minimum size would just delay those landings temporarily. And the comments that supported option C for scheduled changes to measures said that they preferred this option because changing the measures as soon as possible would be the best thing for the stock. And they also said that a minimum gauge increase is essential for the fishery to remain viable in the years ahead. Some mentioned that they observed after the last time the gauge increased that there were benefits to the stock and that we should act now while there's still time to reverse the negative trends that have been observed. And now I'm going to switch over to the advisory panel report. Unfortunately, our AP chair, Grant Moore, was unable to attend today, so I'm going to give the AP report on his behalf. So the AP met virtually to discuss draft addendum 27 on April 10th, and 10 advisors were able to attend the virtual meeting and provide input. And there was not consensus on a preferred set of management options that came out of that meeting, but the advisors each provided their preferences and some comments on the proposed options. And first I want to go over the areas where the advisors all agreed. So there were a number of issues they agreed on, and this includes a shared desire among them to look after the lobster resource. Some of them mentioned that they do not want to see Gulf of Maine have a similar outcome to Southern New England. And many of the advisors agreed that V-notching has a positive impact on the stock, and they were supportive of standardizing the V-notch definition across the LCMAs in the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock. All of the advisors also agreed that there could be economic impacts associated with the proposed increase to the LCMA1 minimum gauge size, and that could create a disadvantage for the US lobster fishery. Regarding the issue 1 options, 5 advisors supported option B with sub-option B3, which would standardize the V-notch definition, and 1 advisor also supported the other 3 sub-options as well. Regarding issue 2, 5 advisors preferred status quo measures, stating that there's not a need to change them at this point in time. 2 of the advisors did not give a preferred option. They were expressing that they were torn between the status quo option and option B, but they generally felt unsure if changing measures at this point is really needed or worth the costs to the fishery, but they don't want to see the stock end up in a bad condition. And then when asked if they had to choose one of the options other than status quo, the majority of advisors would prefer the trigger mechanism over the schedule changes. All right, so that wraps up the AP report and leads us to the board's actions for consideration today. So first, the board would need to select a management program from the proposed options in addendum 27, including issue 1 and issue 2, and alternatively could propose modifications to the options. And then once the board has selected a management program, then the board can consider final approval of draft addendum 27. And that says 8, but it should say 27. All right. And with that, I can wrap up my presentation and take any questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Caitlin. So that's what we'll start with here, are just questions for now, just clarifying questions, and we'll come back around to do the deliberations after that. So any questions for Caitlin on what she just presented? So I see Jim Gilmore first. Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Chairman, and great presentation, Caitlin. I want to just clarify I have this right. So if we did go to a gradual gauge change, that all of those numbers would be predetermined, so that we don't have regulatory authority in New York. And based upon our experience with Jonacred the last 2 years, we really got to do this in one shot. So if we're going to go through this, we have to go through legislation. So this would all be prescribed, whatever, and then we could do it one event for a legislation. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that is accurate.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Next up, I have Dan. No, okay. Next up, I have Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Caitlin, for that. I have a question I think maybe Kathleen could answer it best. Sorry to put you on the spot. I was jotting down things when it's being presented, and so basically we're looking at things that show a decline, pull a trigger. We may need to increase the measure that will result in more eggs, and eventually those eggs will result in more lobsters. This is the process that we're looking at if any of this goes through, right?
Yes.
So we've had several years of declines. How many years after the trigger is pulled and we put more lobsters back, would those lobsters have eggs and become part of the fishery? Be mature enough to be harvested or egging out?
There would be an immediate, for the lobsters that are not caught, there would be an immediate benefit because those lobsters would have the opportunity to reproduce, the ones that are not caught. But the recruitment subsidy would definitely be a time lag. And that recruitment subsidy is not actually considered in our simulation models. And so that would probably have a time lag of 6 to 8 to 10 years. But there is immediate benefit for having those lobsters that are not caught to be able to reproduce, have the opportunity to reproduce rather than be caught.
Just want to make sure I fully understand. I thought it was like 5 or 6 years. So whatever year we do this, or whatever year we actually have to trigger this, which may not be yet, probably isn't yet, will further decline until 6 to 8 years, maybe 10, until the recruit of the eggs of those lobsters can start coming into the fishery to pick it up?
If you're talking about the eggs that need to hatch and then grow large enough to then reproduce again, that is where there is the time lag. There is uncertainty around that, how fast they're growing, but there is a immediate benefit by having more of those lobsters available to reproduce if other changes are happening within the system where not as many of those eggs are surviving. So that's where we see a potential buffer to ecosystem change.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next up I have Mike Luisi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Caitlin, for the presentation. My question, I guess, is a simple one. It's from the graphs that you showed, and please correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but there seem to be reasonable declines happening, which was just mentioned, as well as in the juvenile production. Was I right? Did I see that the graph right on juvenile production's also been in decline over the past few years? And I guess the question that I'd like to ask about that is with everything that I saw in your presentation of declines, the status quo seems to be heavily favored. And I know that you went over the public comment as to some of the reasons why. I'm just trying to understand if there are these declines, why status quo seems to be the favorite for everyone involved.
I can try to speak to the public comments that I heard during the process. I think a lot of the favor for status quo comes from concerns about economic impacts to the fishery associated with changing the gauge sizes. I think that those impacts are to be expected whenever you potentially restrict a measure in this way. So I think there was a lot of concern about that, which caused people to favor status quo. But like I mentioned, there were a handful of folks that did not see status quo as an option and felt that it is necessary to change the measures in order to protect the stock.
Okay, two more in the queue here. David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have also have a question for Kathleen. Kathleen, there was a lot of what I would characterize consternation voiced about the 3 surveys that were used in the index. And I listened to, I think, 5 different public hearings, and almost every single one of them, it came up where members voiced concerns about it, how it was developed, how well it tracks future or predicts future landings. And so the question is, relative to those surveys, how well in the minds of the technical people do those surveys predict future landings? And you can include the Rick Wally survey in there. So it's 4.
So the combined index that Caitlin presented is actually only ventless trap, spring trawl survey, and fall trawl survey from inshore, Maine, New Hampshire survey, as well as Massachusetts and ventless throughout the region. We are not considering the settlement survey from the different states as part of that trigger mechanism. It is information we consider, but it is not part of that trigger index. That trigger index is also focused on just one size of lobster. It's just under legal size. So these are the sublegals that we would expect to recruit into the fishery the next year. So it's very close to that harvestable size, what will be legal very soon in the future. Within the conversations of the technical committee, we were looking at work that was done in the 2020 assessment. We wanted to create a trigger index that was related to the abundance of the whole lobster population. And in the process of the 2020 assessment, we did look at that recruit index of the 71 to 80 millimeter lobsters and how those trends related to the abundance, and found that those trends in the surveys of those 3 surveys do correlate well with the abundance. And so that's where we have some certainty on using those surveys between assessments as a proxy for what might be going on with abundance.
And how about Rick Wally's survey? Does that also track well and predict future abundance?
It is not actually Rick Wally's survey.
Oh, well.
It's the state survey data that is considered. And
I apologize.
we look at it as part of the data update, look at the settlement, but those lobsters are at least 6 to 8 years out from legal size. It is only surveying in shallow areas. We use it as kind of a red flag, canary in the coal mine to say something is changing. And we did see changes since 2012 in, at least in Maine. We've had low levels of settlement in that survey. So we were looking for trends in the recruitment indices from the trawl survey and the ventless trap since the assessment. That is one of the reasons we instituted the data update between the assessments.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is another kind of related to Steve's question, but from a different approach. I mean, I can see our management technique is to to do what we do to try to have increased reproduction, and the assumption being that that will lead to abundance because of more recruitment. But I guess my question to that, though, is if the lack of recruitment is being driven by other factors like warm air acidification or whatever it may be, I guess I had two questions. What confidence do we have then that these management methods will work? And then secondly, when might we know that they're not, and it may be these other factors that are driving the lack of recruitment?
The mechanisms for change is not something we have a lot of certainty about. It could be changes in, we think it's changes in productivity, whether that's warmer water temperatures, survivability, larval starvation, more predation from fish. It could be any of those things. And the guidance that we got from the board and what the technical committee talked about was, if we have changes in the ecosystem ahead, how could we propose management options for the board to consider that might provide more of a buffer to that ecosystem change? And increasing the protection of spawning stock biomass was the mechanism that was focused on and proposed.
Okay, all set with that. Great. Representative Peak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pat Keller at the beginning asked to have added to the end of our agenda a discussion about Canadian competition and, in fact, Canadian regulations. The public hearings that I attended, some of those status quo people were concerned about an increase in the minimum gauge size that would lead to, and the question was then raised, well, will Canada have to abide by that increase in the minimum gauge size? And if not, that puts us at an economic and marketing disadvantage, because there is a market for some of those smaller lobsters. So I am wondering, as you reviewed all of the options again, and many of them include either through trigger or through timing an increase in a minimum gauge size, if we need to have the Canadian competition discussion up front so that we can understand what the total picture is before we start to discuss these various options and go into them. I would like to know what the impact of a decision I'm making is, maybe in the short term, if there's no change in the Canadian regulations, or long term, if that's going to be a number of years, a number of months, or never, that they would match what our minimum gauge size is.
They're good comments, Representative Peak. I think, and so it sounds like your concern is like with the sequence of things here. So point taken, we will have that discussion, and the folks around the table have had a chance to hear your concerns up front. So thanks. Tom Foti.
Yeah, I guess I always assume that what Jersey does is what up and down the coast does. I guess I'm wrong. We do not allow lobsters in that are below our legal size limit. So Canadian lobsters, unless they're our size limit, cannot come in. Are we the only state that does that?
I'll say I don't know if you're the only state that does that, but it is a state decision to make the gauge sizes a possession limit as well as a harvest limit. The Commission's FMP makes it a harvest limit, but some states such as New Jersey have implemented that as a possession standard as well, so that those lobsters cannot be anywhere in the supply chain in the state.
Ray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Caitlin. A question to Kathleen. So the way I heard you explain it to the senator from Maine, this whole management action is based on previous management models, static models. And we're talking about the livelihoods of lobstermen. And we hear a lot about EBFM. We hear a lot about the changing temperatures in the Gulf of Maine. So when does this all get brought to light? Because the way I'm looking at this is we're trying to manage this fishery the way we have in the past with your trawl surveys, your ventless trap. So when do we start accounting for temperature changes, salinity, acidification, different predator species in the Gulf of Maine that might be consuming eggs, young of the year when they settle to the bottom? When do we bring that into our management actions? Thank you.
Not absolutely sure how to answer that question, although I think in the 2020 assessment, we did bring in more of the environmental data sets to consider as part of our model-free evaluation of what is going on with the stock, looking at kind of stress indicators, temperature, other, I think zooplankton. We looked at a number of different data sets as part of trying to understand what was going on with the lobster stock.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to add something to that as well. During the discussions that the technical committee had when the PDT tasked them with trying to come up with some potential management options for this document, one of the things that the technical committee kept coming back to was that we don't have control over the environmental conditions, but if we are able to have a larger spawning stock biomass, that if there is a good year where the conditions of the environment are really good for the eggs and for recruitment, that there is a large spawning stock base there to provide that additional input into the population.
Okay. We've had one hand raised from the public. I'm going to just request before I go to this person. We're still on the question and answer portion of the meeting here, so just keep that in mind. But with that, I will go to Beth Cassoni.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I actually had my hand raised by accident. I apologize. I don't have a question at this time.
Okay, thanks, Beth. At least we know we can hear you when you do.
Right, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Looks like we've cleared up all of the questions. Oh, no, we haven't. Go ahead, Dan. Oh, David, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one other question that relates to the issue of the impacts of the gauge increases. I talked to Kathleen briefly before the meeting. There was a lot of discussion about the impacts, at least in some of those hearings, about the impacts being in a range of 20 to 30% decline in landings associated with a gauge increase. And I was just wondering what, and I realize this is a really difficult issue for the technical folks to answer because there are a lot of different moving parts in it, but what is the technical view of how much of a loss and how much of a gain we would get out of the gauge increases? Thank you.
Thanks, David, for the question. There's a difference between short-term costs and long-term costs. It's more straightforward in Area 1 where it's a recruitment-based fishery. We are fishing on that first molt of lobsters coming into their fishery that is being recruited. And short-term, yes, there is a cost in that first year. But when you look at it in the more long term, that is a delayed harvest. So those lobsters that are not caught in that year have that opportunity to reproduce, but also molt again and can be caught at a heavier size. So in the long term, we would anticipate a lower number of lobsters being caught, but at a higher weight in the long term. In the short term, the technical committee talked about this. There was a meeting summary from April of 2021 where we did put some numbers to it based on the growth matrix, and a 30 of an inch would be about 8% proportion of lobsters that wouldn't be caught if you change a 30 of an inch, and a 1/16 of an inch would be about a 16%. But the timing of management, whether you do it January 1st or in the middle of the year, that percentage is very uncertain depending on how that management is carried out. So many of the technical committee members were not as comfortable throwing those numbers around. We were focused more about the long-term benefit of increasing the spawning stock biomass and then what that impact would be over the long term. And that's where we saw a lower number, but a higher weight total in the longer term.
So follow up, Mr. Chairman, the gain in weight, Kathleen, after they molt, how does it affect the weight? Is it, I think Burton had done an analysis that indicated 6% increase in weight. But what I'm asking you is, what was the consensus of the technical committee?
In the simulation models that Burton and Jeff ran, and I will defer to Jeff if he wants to step in here, but going to 3 3/8, we estimated about a 5% increase, I believe, in weight and a decrease of 3.6. But those numbers are an estimate based on a model, and where the technical committee has uncertainty about where those numbers fall, we do have some certainty about that directionality of which direction it is likely to go. So you are likely to see that benefit. We also estimated that we'd have up to that size a 38% increase in spawning stock biomass. Those numbers are not certain. They're from a model, but the directionality, you would see, we would anticipate a big bump in that spawning stock biomass by changing that minimum gauge size.
Thank you.
Yes, Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A quick question. Since the prevailing public sentiment at the hearing seemed to be in favor of gradual changes as opposed to a one-year change, refresh my memory with the options. There weren't times when more than one vent size change would occur in a fishery, was there? Or was the vent size changed at most one time in the options? Which was it, Caitlin? Thank you.
Yeah, that's correct. The vent size is only proposed to change one time in any of the proposed management options, and that would be whenever the final minimum gauge size is implemented for the area. And so we're just talking about area 1 because area 1 is the only one where there's a proposed minimum gauge size increase. So whenever area 1 reaches its final minimum gauge size, the vent size would also change.
Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question about the math. You said we would catch less lobsters, but they would be heavier. Why would we catch less? Is that a very short-term thing? I'm not exactly sure. It's probably short-term, but.
You would catch lobsters, less lobsters, because you have natural mortality as they're growing. You're going to lose some lobsters on an annual basis to natural mortality, but also some of those lobsters would be reproductive. But I'll defer to Jeff or Caitlin if they want to add to that.
So just in general, the proposed changes would decrease the window of sizes that are available to the fishery. So there would be a smaller amount of lobsters available to be caught.
You okay, Eric? Good. Okay, I think that does it for questions. So let's go ahead and move into, oh, go ahead, Dan.
No, not a question, but I wanted to move into the sequencing of some of our deliberations. What I'd like to speak to is reversing kind of the order that's been presented in the document, which is issue 1, issue 2, by taking up issue 2 first. Issue 2 is the potential minimum size increase that's either based on a trigger or automatic, and that's where most of the resiliency is going to come. The issue 1 tend to be more housekeeping measures or smaller have smaller effect on the spawning stock biomass and the resiliency. And it would be difficult or to rationalize why we would do the issue 1 actions if issue 2 failed. So I would like to see the board tackle issue 2 first.
Yep, thank you, Dan. I'm in complete agreement. Was going to suggest the same thing myself. So let's, maybe I'll look around. Is there anyone on the board who does not like that idea? The suggestion is to just reverse the issues, tackle issue 2 first, and then come back to issue 1. So the suggestion was made by Dan McKiernan, and I was also contemplating making the same suggestion. Looking around the table, not seeing anyone jumping up, raising their hand. So we will move forward in that manner. Thanks for that, Dan. One other thing I just wanted to say up front, this is simply because at least one of the options that we may take up, it's, you know, these triggers, there's 2 numbers, right? They sort of bound the issue, but there's a continuum in between those 2 things. And over the years, watching boards, when they have that kind of situation, bouncing back and forth a whole bunch of times on different numbers and all of the substitutes and things like that. So I just want to say up front, I'm only going to allow 1 substitution at a time. So if somebody makes a motion, there's a substitution, we'll dispense with that. I don't want to layer substitutions on top of substitutions. I think that's procedurally correct. Anyways, I just wanted to be upfront about that. One other thing I'd like to attempt is there were a couple of items in here that didn't get much discussion. So I'm going to try and simplify our job here in a couple of spots, just to see if we can quickly drop out one of the multitude of options here. So when we get to those parts, I'll ask the question and see if we can simplify our job a little bit here. So I just wanted to let you know what I was thinking there. I'm not trying to limit discussion or anything like that, just trying to gain some efficiencies if possible. And then finally, I will plan on at least 1 opportunity for public comment. I'm going to do that once we're ready to take action on some sort of a final motion on the addendum. So before we take action on it, but once we get through all of the board deliberations. You know, there's been a lot of comment on this addendum already, and mostly I'm concerned about time and we don't have a lot of time on the agenda here for this. So I want to make sure we're efficient and can get done what we need to get done today. If we're doing good, I will entertain additional opportunities, but I do promise to go to the public, but I will probably only do that 1 time towards once we get the 2 issues in some semblance of a final shape. All right, so with that, why don't we jump right to it? The first item here that we're going to tackle is issue 2. This is the implementing management measures to increase protection of spawning stock biomass in the Gulf of Maine and the Georges Bank stock. So here's the first spot where I will ask the question, is there any discussion or any need to address the potential option to adopt management changes without the institution of a trigger mechanism? So that's the option C. Is there anybody who wants to speak to that option C? Dave Borden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep this really quick. I favor that option, but I've talked to enough people around the table to gauge the sentiment on it. So I just don't think it's going to go anyplace. Reason I favor that option, and I'm going to be really brief, is that having gone through the Southern New England collapse, I was basically the state director at the time. And having gone through that, that was an awful, totally awful experience, not only for the industry, but for the regulators. It was just astounding how what the negative consequences were for a whole group of really hardworking, dedicated individuals who had generations in their families that had grown up working the water. Anything we can do to avoid that type of situation, and I think we should do. And it's the main reason that I'm very concerned about the triggers. And it goes back to Steve Train's comment. He hit the nail on the head. The delays. If we set a trigger, we're essentially acknowledging the fact that we're going to allow the stock condition to deteriorate until we hit that trigger. Now, I'll say right up front, I operate under no delusions here. I don't think that we can maintain the stock at historic highs. I think it's going to decline anyways, but it's a question of timing when you react. Because once we react, if we get optimal conditions, it's still going to take 8 years before you're going to see the recruitment in the indices. That's a long time to allow a fishery that's worth $2 billion, employs 30,000 people, and has, particularly in Eastern Maine, has coastal communities that have a 90% reliance on this for their economic activity. This is a really major decision on the part of the commission. We're in a leadership position on it. Now, I'm concerned that these triggers, when we were talking about triggers originally, I was an enthusiastic supporter of the trigger because we were talking about a trigger of 15%. Now we're talking about triggers at 30%, 50%. And it goes back to the question I asked Kathleen about how well these indices track future landings. If they do, you're essentially saying to coastal communities, you're going to lose 50% of your income before you recover from it. So that's what my reservation is. I'm not going to make a motion, but I think it's the wrong strategy at the wrong time. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Words of caution are appreciated. So you're not making a motion on that option. Okay. Mike Pentney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and hi, everybody. It's been quite a while since I've been able to attend a Lobster Board meeting in person, so I appreciate being here this afternoon. Yeah, as similar to David Borden, I'm not going to speak specifically to making a motion on the immediate or specified approach, but I did want to offer some sort of general comments about the resiliency framework or resiliency addendum. You know, I think we all acknowledge that the lobster fishery, particularly in the Gulf of Maine, is under, significant existential threats. I think from three avenues. The effects of climate change that we're seeing on the stock and recruitment. That's what we're focused on today. But nobody around the table is forgetting or ignoring the threats to the lobster fishery as we try to recover North Atlantic right whales in a way that preserves and maintains that fishery. And there's also the train that's left the station for offshore wind that I think we all acknowledge is coming to the Gulf of Maine. And those are all, presenting extreme threats to the lobster fishery. Unless we see some statutory changes, the challenges around recovering right whales and the international lobster fishery, that's going to be something that we continue to face. The offshore wind issue, I think we see that coming, and that's going to remain a challenge. Ideally, I think we'd be looking at ways to preserve and ensure the resiliency of this fishery in ways that look for synergies across those three threats, in ways that we can mitigate those threats as meaningfully as possible. Effort reductions, effort issues aren't on the table today. The one thing that is on the table is gauge increases to look at promoting increased recruitment. And, I encourage the board to be as aggressive as possible. We've heard some of the concerns that David Borden raised, the concerns we've seen in some of the public comment and letters from some states around the need to take action sooner rather than later because of the delayed effect we see before we're going to see increased recruitment to the fishery. So, you know, like David Borden, I recognize that where we're going to end up is probably with some sort of trigger approach. But I just strongly encourage the board to be as aggressive and thoughtful as possible so that we can really ensure that we have a resilient fishery rather than be having a reactive fishery where we are struggling to adapt or adopt to a stock and collapse. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Just maybe one favor for me. My ears never unpopped from the plane ride this morning, so just make sure you get that microphone up close. So I did hear you, Mike, and thank you for that, but I'm just nervous and I might not hear folks, so thanks for that. Okay, so, you know, a couple of notes of caution, but no motions for, nobody looking to make a motion on option C. So I think that kind of drops us back to, we're on issue 2, remember. So we've got options A and B remaining. Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back in 2017, I was the originator of the motion that started this addendum. Lots happened since then. I've started to get gray hair. We've survived a global pandemic. I think Borden may have had more hair back then too. I mean, it's we've come I think we may have set a record from delays, but those delays were needed based on the issues that we were dealing with. And I think we're at a time now where we're at a very different time in making this decision if we had done these back in 2017 and where we're at even higher abundance. So I appreciate David's words of caution here. I'm not willing to go there, but we do need to start a conversation around this trigger. I'm gonna start with a motion. I think Caitlin has that. Besides the 3 public hearings in Maine, I've held 7 zone council meetings. They were excellent conversations. We've seen certainly an embracing of the use of a trigger, including in our easternmost areas, zones A and B, actually asking for probably the highest trigger on the coast because they are seeing more, probably because of what they're seeing in their traps for juvenile lobsters. But as you can imagine, with a 3,000+ mile coastline, the opinions vary greatly, but the need for action, I think, was certainly coming to the forefront. So I would like to make a motion, and actually, Caitlin, if you could change the 40 to 38, please. I'd like to make a motion to select under issue 2, option B, a trigger level of 38%. And if I get a second, I'll give additional rationale.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Second from Doug Grout. Okay, great. So back to you, Pat.
Yeah, thank you. So 38% is the halfway point within the range of the trigger mechanism from 32 to 45. It certainly is going to put us, below 100 million pounds from a fishery standpoint for just the state of Maine. But what I've heard consistently up and down the coast was we need to act, but we're coming down from an all-time high. And I think that's why people were willing to actually push for even the 45%. But frankly, I'm from a biological standpoint, and for some of the issues that have been raised already, I'm uncomfortable going that far. Would like to, and I know frankly, some of the members around the table are not even comfortable with the 38. So I'm open for discussion, but would like to start it with this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Doug, do you wish to add anything?
Am I on? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I would support this. I also
Don't believe that we can wait until we get to 42%. I think that would be extremely dangerous. This might be a good compromise between 32 and 42. So thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Cherie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay? While I appreciate this motion and appreciate the compromise, I am still concerned about even a 38% trigger level. I think that we need to continue to be a little bit more proactive than reactive. While we will likely be able to see if the trigger is tripped, we would be able to see if there's Young of the Year recruitment sooner than 8 years. You know, we have the Young of the Year survey out there, we have the trial surveys out there that would be picking up samples to determine what our recruitment will be coming into the fishery at least. But I still think that we need to be a little bit more proactive. So I would like to have a motion to amend to select under issue 2, option B, a trigger level of 35%. And if I can get a second, then I can move forward with a reason. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherie. Seconded by Dan McKiernan. Thanks, Dan. Okay, Cherie, back to you.
Thank you again. Again, this is a compromise because I would have liked to have gone to the 32%, but I think this is a compromise between the 32 and the 38. And I think that this is still being on the proactive side than a reactive side. Thank you.
Okay, Dan as the seconder.
I endorse Cherie's comments.
Thanks. Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, if our numbers are from 2021, when will we know if we may have already hit this trigger amount level?
Do you have a comment on that, Kathleen? Or Caitlin does. Hang on one second.
Sorry, I had to move locations, but the data update would have this information in it, and we will be presenting that at the annual meeting.
Okay, other
If I may
comments?
just follow up, I guess that it makes it a little difficult to know, you know, what we're saying in terms of implementation. I think if one imagines that we're not there yet, then we set a trigger and that we wait a while. But if we find out in the fall that, as a matter of fact, we are up pretty, you know, high or well beyond what is even being proposed. So I guess that I am kind of affirming what Cherie has noted, that we probably need to maybe set a little more aggressive level because we may already be beyond it.
Thank you, Senator. Ray Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of questions to the maker of the first motion and then to Cherie on the amended motion. Pat, you said that your zones down east were more in favor of the highest trigger, which brings me back to my thought pattern that we all know that we've got this dynamic shift of all species to the east-northeast. So I can understand the lobstermen down east wanting the highest trigger. And I would almost support a 40% trigger. But that being said, these are the motions on the table. And I don't understand why we're talking about a 35%. You just want to mediate, Cherie, or? Thank you.
Go ahead, Cherie.
Thank you. Yes, actually, I think that 32% was not very appetizing from the industry perspective and from around this table. I wouldn't want to go above 35%, to be honest with you. 38% is something that was presented in this motion, so I chose to take the halfway point to go there. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherie. Thank you, Pat.
All right, so we had a motion that's been amended. Any additional discussion before we take the vote on the amended motion? All right, seeing none, why don't I give folks a minute or two to caucus, in particular if you don't have folks here at the table. So I don't know, 2 minutes to caucus. Okay, does anybody need a little more time? Mike's still standing up, you okay? Looks like he's heading back. Okay. I think we are ready to go, so we will vote on the amended motion here. This is the motion to amend to select under issue 2, option B, a trigger level of 35%. Motion made by Ms. Patterson, seconded by Mr. McKiernan. So all those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Is it a question, Roy? Go ahead.
Could I request a roll call on that vote?
Yes, that
I
would
have
be.
my reasons for that. We want to see how much unanimity there are among the principal lobster states to the north of us.
Yeah, thank you, Roy. I think that will help too with the hybrid situation we have here as well. So I'm sorry.
I can just call the states out if you have everybody raise their hand.
You said you could do it, Tony?
Yeah, if everyone just re-raises their hand that said yes, I'll call your name out.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, maybe I'm misunderstanding. What?
Put their hands up and I'll call the states out. If everybody puts their hands up, I will call your state name and then that will be the roll call.
Okay, I gotcha. Thank you, Tony. Okay, so let's try again. All those in favor, please raise your hand, and then Tony will call the roll here.
Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, North Carolina. New Hampshire. Oh.
Okay, I think that, did we get the hands online as well? Okay, everyone is here, good. All right, all those opposed, please raise your hand.
Massachusetts.
Okay, any abstentions?
NOAA Fisheries, Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland.
And any null votes?
Maine.
So just checking down the table, can you give me the numbers again, either Caitlin or Tony? Was 6 to approve.
I got 5, 1, 4, 4, 1.
Okay, thank you. So the motion passes 5-1 with 4 abstentions and 1 null. Thank you for that. So now the amended motion is the main motion. Any discussion now on this as the main motion before we move forward with our follow-up vote? Okay, seeing no hands. We're kind of in the same spot, so I don't know if there's a need to caucus, although we had to, I'm seeing heads shaking around the table. So why don't we move forward and take the vote? So we now have a main motion. The main motion is to amend, I'm sorry. This should be motion to select under issue 2 option, sorry, wait till it settles out here. Motion to select under issue 2 option B, a trigger level of 35%. Okay. The amended motion is still the maker and the seconder, correct? Okay. Okay. So we can go to the vote. All right. So all those in favor of the main motion, please raise your hand. We'll call them out again, please.
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire.
All those opposed, please raise your hand. Okay, didn't see any hands there. Any abstentions?
NOAA Fisheries.
And any null votes? No nulls. All right, so the motion passes. I got 10 to approve with 1 abstention. Looks like I counted right that time. Great. Okay, thank you for that, everyone. Let's move along here, and I'll go to Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To continue on with issue 2, I have a second motion prepared. I think staff has that. And so with this motion is the creation of a table to help us kind of follow the bouncing ball here, if you will. I would move to select under issue 2, option B, a modified measures option 2, in which LMA 3 and Outer Cape Cod move to a 6½ inch minimum gauge size in the final year changes and do not decrease their maximum gauge size further. Initial changes to the gauge size for all of Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank management areas should occur on June 1st in the following year. For example, if a trigger is tripped in the fall at the fall annual meeting in 2023, a minimum gauge size change would be implemented June 1, 2024. Should a future and further on, should a future stock assessment conclude that the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock are not a single biological unit, the board can revisit the maximum gauge size decrease in Outer Cape Cod and LMA 3.
Thank you, Pat. So there's a motion on the board. Is there a second to that motion? Cherie Patterson with the second. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, just a quick comment for the record. I think when Mr. Kelleher read that into the record, I think he said minimum after 6.5, where in the first sentence, I think he meant maximum.
I did.
When you read it. So I just want to make sure the record's clear.
Thank you for that clarity. Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification. So Pat Kelleher with the motion, seconded by Cherie Patterson. So Pat, as the maker of the motion, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, thank you. One thing that I heard really clear from fishermen in Maine is the fact that if this is a resiliency addendum and that we all should be playing a part in the resiliency of the stock. Certainly, we heard from our technical committee chair the bigger biological benefit being those smaller lobsters and the minimum gauge size change. But it's clear based on comments that I've heard that the protection of those bigger, older lobsters are still incredibly important when it comes to stock resiliency. So after having conversations with fishermen back home, looking at the data, understanding what the economic potential economic impact would be, I've created this motion to be kind of less threatening from that standpoint on the max gauge size decrease by pushing it out to the final year of implementation, so 5 years out. And again, I'd just reiterate that this is one stock. There is some additional tagging data that's coming in that has raised some questions about that one stock. And that's why I include information or a piece of this regarding the stock assessment, the future stock assessment, where we could revisit that and make adjustments accordingly.
Great, thank you, Pat. And Cherie, as a seconder, would you like to make a comment?
Yes, thank you. I do agree with what Pat had indicated, as well as get back to Mr. Petney's comment on what's going to be happening in the future with the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team and how that might be addressing resiliency in our future. And it would be aligning better to have this offshore, you know, the LMA 3 and such to be a size maximum change later on. Thank you.
Okay, other comments from the board on the motion before us? Tom Foti.
I just asked a question for everybody over here and nobody has an answer. So I figure Maynard can tell me, how much does a 6-inch carapace lobster weigh?
I think that oh, Steve's got it.
Off the top of my head, I'd say 6 to 7 pounds, depending on whether it's a male or female. But I'm not allowed to land them, so I'm not sure.
Doug Rout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I will express support for this motion, although I do have one small adjustment that I would like to propose that based on some of the comments that we got in the our public hearings regarding when the gauge, the vent size change would take place. And my motion, which I sent out just recently, is to move to amend that the increase in the escape vent size in LCMA 1 be implemented in year 5 after the trigger has been reached. So essentially move it down to that year 5 implementation as opposed to year 3 implementation. And if I can get a second, I'll be glad to give my rationale for it.
Okay, thanks, Doug. So there's a motion to amend here. It has to do with the escape vent size. Is there a second to that motion, the motion to amend? Seconded by Steve Train. Okay, back to you, Doug, for your reasoning.
So when we were at public hearing, our lobstermen expressed more concern about having that vent size increase in the same year that we have the gauge, the final gauge increase, because they're already going to be taking a hit for in year 1 and then year 3, at least a temporary hit in their landings. And they know that right now, some of the current vent size, some of the legal size lobsters do go, are able to escape through the escape vent. So they were feeling that if we could delay the implementation of the vent size change, it would make it easier to handle the 3rd year increase in size. And if we all remember, when we put in vent size changes in the past, I'm pretty sure they were occurring after the gauge size, the gauge increases that we had. It wasn't in the same year. So that's my rationale. I'm just trying to see if there might be some support for this, just waiting a couple years. Some lobstermen may end up implementing it themselves right away, but on their own. But I think it's a reasonable to give them a little bit of a cushion or a little bit of a breather here.
Thanks, Doug. Steve, do you wish to make a comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I could live without this, but I do like this idea. It kind of slows down the too much at once thing a little bit. And I think Doug hit the nail on the head with a lot of people may do it anyway. You fill that parlor up with shorts, you're not going to get many counters in it anyway. So once those things start to change, I think you'll see people voluntarily moving that vent up before it's due anyway.
Okay, further discussion, Dave Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm still not fully understanding why this would be year 5 versus year 4. I mean, we did this when I worked for the state of Rhode Island. We did this a number of times. I think we went through 8 gauge changes, maybe even 10. We always tried to follow the gauge change immediately, either the same year as the gauge change or the year after we would change the vent size. So this is talking about a 2-year delay, and I just don't get the logic of it. These two measures work hand in hand, and that's the way they're intended to work. So I could see year 4, some logic in that, but not year 5. Thank you.
Okay, additional comments from the board? Dan McKiernan.
Question on protocol. If what David Borden just said, wanting to insert year 4, do we need to vote this down consistent with your desires to only have one substitute or amended motion at a time, so that we can come back with a year 4 implementation of that, if that's the desire of the board, given David's logic?
I'm looking down the table for a little help.
Go through the motions. It's the property of the board at this point. We have to.
Right, so yeah, we have to vote up or down, and then we can sort of move on from there. Thanks. Okay, so we have an amended motion before us. Why don't we take another 2-minute caucus to discuss, and then we'll come back and take the vote. So 2 minutes, please. That seemed to work last time. Okay, looks like everybody's back to the table, done discussing. So I think we can go ahead and call the vote here. We'll follow the same procedure. I'll have you raise your hands and Tony will call out the states. So all those in favor of the amended motion, please raise your hand.
Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut.
Okay, all those opposed, please raise your hand.
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, NOAA fisheries.
Any abstentions?
Virginia, Maryland, Delaware.
And any no votes? Okay. By my count, the motion fails. I had 3 to approve. It was either 5 to oppose, 3 abstentions. So the motion fails. So we're back to the original motion, and I have a hand up from David Borden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make the same motion that Mr. Grout made, basically move to amend that the increase in the escape vent size in LCMA 1 be implemented in year 4 after the trigger has been reached.
So there's a new motion to amend. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so we have a new motion to amend made by David Borden. Is there a second to that motion? I saw Steve Train first. So back to you, David, to make a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't belabor the point. I made it before, so that still stands. There's a synergy between these two, and this just lines that up. You want these two actions to follow each other. Thank you.
Okay, Steve. Steve is good. Any other discussion on the amended motion? Doug, go ahead.
Just want to say I support this motion since mine failed. Sounds like a good idea.
Well, that bodes well. Thank you. Okay, so do folks need, can anyone raise their hand if you need some time to caucus? Okay, so we have an amended motion here. It's similar to the one that was just made, but it drops it back a year, so it would be implemented in year 4. So let's go ahead and call the vote. All those in favor of the amended motion, please raise your hand.
Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia.
Any opposed? I don't think there's anyone left. Any abstentions?
No fisheries.
Okay, there was one person left. Any no votes? No votes. Okay, so the amended motion passes. So that now becomes the main motion. I'll let that get up on the board here, and then we'll go ahead. Dan, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to amend to essentially strip this motion of the maximum size changes in Area 3 and Outer Cape Cod that is scheduled to go in according to this motion. Shall I give a rationale now?
So looking for a little help, we had an amended motion that passed. We didn't vote on it as the main motion, but can we entertain another amendment?
Yes, I think because you've cleared the state of all the previous amendments, and now you're back to one main motion. So now Dan is suggesting a motion that would amend the main motion again. So it's fair.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, so we've got a new motion to amend, has to do with the maximum gauge. I saw a second from David Borden. So back to you, Dan, for rationale.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm seeking to make the maximum size in Area 3 and Outer Cape static at the 6 3/4 inch size because of the historic contributions that those areas made to the resiliency in the Gulf of Maine when the measures went in to protect the southern New England stock. We know that Outer Cape Cod and Area 3 both have portions of their fishery in the southern New England area. And for the last 15 years or so, we did very little action concerning the Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank. We did a lot of activity attributable to the southern New England stock, which included aggressive trap cuts, included gauge increases, and I would like to give those fleets the credit for those that have already been made.
We're still getting the motion up on the board here, but David, while that's being typed out, anything to add?
Yeah, I just add to the points that Dan just made. You know, since all the gauges were standardized in 1989, not to give everybody a history lesson. Since 1989, the minimum size in Area 1 has been 3 1/4, and there have been 9 gauge changes in Area 3. since that period. Most of those gauge changes took place right in proximity to the Southern New England collapse. And when that took place, the Area 3 industry, and I'd point out that this is not just a New England issue, it goes all the way down. We have Maryland boats, 6 New Jersey boats, 3 New York boats. They're all fishing in Area 3. The industry opted to implement the most conservative measures throughout Area 3 instead of applying it just to Southern New England and the Georgia portion of it. So we've been adopting more restrictive regulations for quite a period of decades, actually. And so the only thing I would add to Dan's point, this doesn't get implemented according to the motion for 5 years. And I think, yeah, at least in our case, we're looking at other ways to contribute to the protection of spawning stock biomass through things like a ring size and so forth. We've got dialogues going with the center staff about that. And so we oppose it at this time, but we're going to continue to work on it. And I think that the commission can easily add it to some subsequent addendum later on. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So we've got the motion up there. I'm wondering is the table correct? Okay. All right. Further discussion on the amended motion. Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And with all respect to my fellow commissioners from Rhode Island and Massachusetts, I'm going to speak against this. We are dealing with a situation that was requiring the possible rebuilding the stock through egg production. And this needs to be shared through the range of the resource in the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock are currently one stock. And this is their share of what we need to do. And it appears this motion would do away with that.
Thank you, Steve. Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to speak against the motion to amend. What I was trying to do is put some forever protections in place. It is clear that these management areas don't operate in biological isolation. So recruitment from Area 3 comes from growth of lobsters within that area and immigration of lobsters outside of that area. The addendum says that 70% of the new females in LMA3 come from that immigration. So this connectivity means that we all need to be chipping in to the resilient, as far as resiliency is concerned. Also trying to offset economic impacts here with my original motion. The addendum shows that moving to a 6-inch minimum would result in a 4.6% decrease. That was why I only made a motion to move it down 1/4 of an inch to help offset what that impact would be. But again, I just want to stress that we're not taught. This is a joint stock between Area 3 and Area 1, Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank. It's one management stock. We're not. There's no isolation between these stocks as it currently exists. And I would urge the board to support something that is in place in the future. And I would also point out that the language that I included, if there is a determination that there is isolation, the board can revisit this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Cherie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, at this point, I can't support the motion to amend. I think that since this is one stock that we are speaking of, that all need to be participating in the resiliency action. And this was a very gradual, thought out process to not have LMA3 involved up until the 5th year. So if there is any further information in the future, then we can take action if need be. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. Representative Peak.
Thank you. I'd like to speak in support of this motion. As we're talking about sharing responsibility, I would like to point out that status quo right now for the Outer Cape area is there is no maximum gauge size. So going from no maximum gauge to a 6.5 is a major contribution on top of the contributions that have already been made towards stock resiliency by the Outer Cape lobstermen. I can live with 6 3/4 for both LMA3 and OCC, but given that already the OCC lobster area, they have a larger minimum gauge size than any of the other lobster management areas. They are contributing in that way. For all intents and purposes, they have a shortened season because of right whale protections. As I drove to get to Boston just yesterday, driving through the Beach Point area, I could see boats ready and traps ready and buoys ready, but the right whales are still in Cape Cod Bay and used to be May 1st, May 15th the last several years. Who knows, it could be after Memorial Day. The point is there is no fishing that's going on in Cape Cod Bay and on the backside of the beach. So I think that 6 3/4 is a compromise that we should go with here. And again, as I said, I would like to point out for the OCC lobstermen whose management plan was approved, that they are going from no maximum gauge to 6.5 under the original proposal. And this is why I believe this amendment offers a fair compromise.
Okay, looking around the table, I don't see hands for further discussion. Can you please raise your hand if anybody needs time to caucus before we call the vote? Okay, let's do a 1-minute caucus on this one. We're starting to get close to Menhaden time, so 1-minute caucus. Okay, that was the 1 minute. New York, are you okay? I got a thumbs up. Great. All right, let's call the question on the amended motion. All those in favor, please raise your hand.
Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York.
All those opposed, please raise your hand.
Maine, New Hampshire, New Jersey, no fisheries, Maryland, and Virginia.
Abstentions?
Delaware.
Null votes? None. Okay, the amended motion fails. So that brings us back to the, I think that's back to the previously amended motion, which is now the main motion. Anything else before we vote on the main motion? Tony?
I just want to make it abundantly clear that the language in the motion itself plus the table are the things that we will be implementing. Since the table has vent sizes which are not in the language of the motion, it is in the text of the option that it does say is modified, but I just want to put it on record and make it clear to the board and the public for transparency.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate that clarification. Okay, so we'll wait for the cleaned up motion to get back on the board here. I believe that is the correct motion that's up before us. I'm seeing nodding heads. Does anybody need time before we take a vote? Nobody's raising their hand. So all those in favor of the motion up on the board here, please raise your hand.
Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia.
All those opposed, please raise your hand.
Massachusetts,
Abstentions?
NOAA fisheries.
No votes? None. Okay, the main motion passes. That was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, with 1 opposed and 1 abstention. 9 in favor. Sorry, I'm missing somebody. I must not be turning my head far enough. Thank you for that. So it was 9 to approve, 1 to oppose, 1 abstention. Great. Okay. I believe that is it for issue 2. I'm seeing nodding heads. So we are now back to issue 1. Is there anybody who wishes to get a motion on the table for issue 1? Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think staff has a motion. Thank you. So I've combined 2 here, so bear with me, and there's no, and I'll ask the executive director to watch out for my dyslexia. Move to approve issue 1, sub-option B1 and sub-option B4. This combination of options will set a standard V-notch definition of 1/8 inch in LCMA 3 and out of Cape Cod, maintain the zero tolerance definition in LCMA 1, and establish a maximum gauge size in Outer Cape Cod of 6 3/4 for state and federal permit holders. It will also limit the issuance of trap tags to equal the harvester trap tag allocation.
Okay, is there a second to the motion? Dave Borden with the second. So Pat, back to you for rationale.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, the one thing that this addendum was going to work to achieve was some consistency in regulations. As we all know, especially with V-notch definitions, they are all over the place. I think it doesn't bring them totally in line, but it brings them in line to a point where the LCMAs will be operating in a consistent fashion. I've had some additional conversations with Dan McKernan about some of the commerce issues that Dan has, which I was sympathetic to. So that's one of the reasons I left them separate. And just quickly on the trap tag allocations, Maine has a very administratively heavy issue associated with ensuring that people aren't fishing 880 traps. So you have to go through a process to request trap tags if they are lost. You can't, we do not give the 880 up front. And honestly, I'm just looking, I think we need to have equity here. There is and Cherie has brought this up several times with the other motions. We all know we have a whale problem. So ensuring that those 880 are not fished does help eliminate some additional end lines, which I think, be it small, it's an important step in the right direction for those conversations. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Pat. David as the seconder.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only thing I'd like to comment on, I think Pat summarized things well. These are really 2 different motions. It might make sense to take the last sentence in the motion, separate them into 2 motions and discuss them separately and vote on them separately. Because I think if we try to do it together, it's going to get a little bit confusing. I have a number of, I support what Pat has suggested here, but I have a number of suggestions to make when we get to the trap issuance. And I think there's going to be a lot of discussion on that. So my suggestion to Pat is he just agree to a perfection and separate it into 2 motions. Just the last line, Pat.
David, are you making a motion to split?
Well, I was hoping he'd do it by a perfection, which I would agree to.
You already seconded it. It's a motion of the board.
I'll make a motion to separate it in 2 questions.
Okay, motion to separate. Is there a second to that motion? Dan McKiernan. just to clarify, David, you were just talking about separating out the last sentence of the original motion, correct?
Correct.
We could just vote on, okay, so there's a motion to split. Well, let's go ahead and vote on that. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Oh. Okay, we'll go faster. Are there any objections to the motion to split? Seeing none, thank you. That's probably saved us several minutes. Okay, so now we will have two separate motions on this because that motion passed by consent. So now, Dan McKiernan, go ahead.
Just a point of clarification, the addendum states that these actions, which is issue 1, would be enacted immediately upon adoption of the addendum, but that's subject to rulemaking. So I'm hoping that it's within the expectations of the board, should this be approved, that would likely be 2024. Because for the Commonwealth to enact any of these changes, I'd be going to rulemaking. It would get done by the end of the year.
Pat, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, obviously every state's going to have different processes by which we have to go through from a rulemaking perspective. So to that point, I agree with Dan McKernan that the implementation is upon final. We may have 2 dates on implementation at the end. I would look to Caitlin when we get to that point, but we're going to have time to do rulemaking, or they'll have to have time to do rulemaking.
Understanding that the sort of pragmatism of that is that kind of implicit in the motion, or do we need to say something explicit in the motion?
I think you can take it up during the implementation date of the document, but if it's, if anybody is concerned, we can add it to the motion.
Excellent. Okay, so we are back to now the first half of the split motion. Are we okay to move forward with this, or do I? No, we're good. Oh, sorry. Representative Peak, go ahead.
I'd like to make a motion to amend this motion before us now, please.
Okay.
To read as follows, move to approve issue 1, sub-option B1. This option will set a V-notch definition of 1/8 inch in LCM A3 and will set a V-notch definition of 1/8 inch in OCC to be implemented upon the trigger previously voted on by this board in option 2 being met. And then the rest is of the language stays as written.
Okay, there is a motion to amend. Is there a second to the motion to amend? Last call for a second for the motion to amend. Okay, motion fails for lack of a second.
Sarah, is that the intent of what you said?
Yeah, let me read it. So what my intent was that the change in the V-notch definition would only be implemented when the trigger was met.
For Outer Cape only, right?
For Outer Cape only, yep. Correct.
Since the motion wasn't up there when I called for the second, I'll do one last shot at a second. Okay, still no second for the amended motion, so fails for lack of a second. Okay, Roy.
Mr. Chairman, I'm wondering if you could help me clear up a little bit. With the wording in this motion, are we consistent with what we just passed, which is no longer before us, regarding issue 2? I think we are, at least for the OCC of 6 3/4 inches. But how about LCMA area 3? This motion is silent, I think, for LCMA 3, is it not? In terms of maximum gauge size? So it's already set at 6 3/4?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so back to the split motion here. Are we ready to call the question? Does anybody need time to caucus? All right, so let's go ahead and call the question. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand.
Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia.
All those opposed, please raise your hand.
Massachusetts,
Any abstentions?
NOAA fisheries.
Any null votes? Okay, so the first half of the split motion passes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to approve, 1 opposed, 1 abstention. So I think now the second half, I'll let that get recorded. Okay. So the second half of that, the split motion, move to approve issue 1, sub-option B4. This will limit the issuance of trap tags to equal harvester trap tag allocations. Discussion on the motion. Go ahead, Dan.
Yes, I would like to request a friendly amendment and create an exemption for the Outer Cape lobster permit holders, and I'll tell you why. It's a very unique area in that there are 66 permit holders fishing about 27,000 traps, and the average among these fishermen is about 420. So the area is trap starved, and just about I would say everyone is fishing to their limit, including many who fish single trap operations because of the challenges of the harbors that they leave, such as Nauset Inlet, where about a third of our fishery is. So I would ask that the Outer Cape fishermen still be given a 10% extra trap tag allowance. The difference between us and Maine is that Maine is responsible for the trap tag issuance, whereas we allow the fishermen to go directly to the vendor. And if we go to this kind of a system, there's going to be inordinate delays where as each fisherman loses a few traps, and that's going to happen season long, they would be contacting us and then contacting the vendor. I just don't think administratively it's worth it. And so I would beg for the commission's indulgence to create an exemption for the Outer Cape Cod. Like I said, there's at least more than half of these fishermen fish less than 500 traps. And as opposed to like in Area 1, where the average might be like 500 or 600, but people are still allowed to get 800 trap tags. And so there is some extra trap tags even in the Area 1 system for those who aren't fishing up to the limit, but that's a trap limit. Whereas in the Outer Cape, it's a trap allocation. So I would beg the board or someone to give me a motion. I'm sorry, a second on my motion to amend, to exempt the Outer Cape Cod from this particular motion.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So there's a motion to amend to exempt the Outer Cape from this. The rest of the motion there, wait for that to get up there. Okay, is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Pat Kelleher, sorry, Sheree. Seconded by Pat Kelleher. Dan, you gave reasoning on it. Anything else? Okay, Pat, anything you want to add?
Just concur. After I understood the issue of the fishery down there and in discussions with Dan, I can see what the need is. So I'm okay with this.
Okay. Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question for Dan. I think I support this. You said most of the guys fish 500 or less. But how many are fishing 800? You've got a lot of guys from Area 1 fishing 800 that you're not going to give it to. Are you going to give the extra tags to the guys with 800 in that area?
Yeah, the answer is 8 out of the 64 permit holders. There's 8 of them. And they fish in the kind of a very rough area, that eastern Cape Shore, with a lot of storm surge and, trap losses happen.
Thank you.
Mike Louisi?
Yeah, thank you. I can support this. I just thought that Dan had mentioned a percentage over an equal harvester trap tag allocation. Dan, did you say something about 10%, or maybe that should be in here if that's the case?
Currently, my state and New Hampshire issue or allow the issuance of 10% additional tags over the trap limit, or in this case, the trap allocation for Outer Cape. So I would like status quo to allow them to continue to get 10%.
Okay, that clears it up. Thanks.
Okay, Tony?
It's the FMP that allows for that, just as an FYI.
So it's already codified. Great. Okay. Mike Penny.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, not a question to the motion to amend, but the overarching motion. The addendum document just says to limit issuance until trap losses occur and are documented. And I just want to ensure, because ultimately this is a piece of this will fall to the federal side to implement as well. And so would like some additional information or clarification in terms of what are the states requiring or accepting as sufficient documentation, what would be acceptable, to make sure that we've got consistency, not only in the regulations, but in the documentation standards that we're applying before we issue the additional 10%. Because there are, a couple handfuls of permit holders that get their trap tags from us. Right now, we just issue the full 110% and want to make sure that we're operating in a consistent manner. But also, because we're the feds, we have to make sure that we're, being really clear and transparent in terms of what's required in order to document those trap losses. So if somebody can provide me a little bit more information, I'd be appreciated. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you, Mike. Does anybody, I wonder, does the commission have a comment on this? So it's kind of a state situation. So Dan, go ahead.
I guess I would ask that we be given time to resolve this question. I don't have a good answer because we get so few requests now, except in a catastrophic loss situation, and we allow them to get a completely new set. But for someone to get, just a small number of replacement trap tags, I agree with Mr. Pentany that we probably need consistency. And if we could do that, and as a committee after this meeting, consulting the state of Maine what their standards are, because Cherie in New Hampshire and I will be doing something a little bit new in terms of that standard, and I'd welcome developing that standard with our federal partners.
Okay, so it sounds like, David, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a question I ask out of ignorance. Somebody has an out of Cape endorsement and a Area 1 endorsement. Are there any permit holders that have permits in both? And if so, how do we handle that? Because you're going to have two different rules.
Go ahead.
The answer is no. We don't have any individuals who are permitted in more than one area in Massachusetts. And since the Outer Cape, to my knowledge, is exclusively a Massachusetts fleet, it's not an issue.
David?
My problem with the exemption, I'm supportive of the attempt here to kind of simplify the rules on this. I've talked to Pat about the burden on his staff, and then when you start factoring in, as Mr. Pentany said earlier, there are a multitude of other considerations we should think about, like whales and vertical lines. It's highly desirable to kind of start winnowing down the traps that are in the water. So, but in my own case, since I in another capacity, I represent the offshore guys. Most of the offshore guys fish their full allocations, and I'm not exaggerating. They've done it. There were very rigorous criteria put in To get them, they had to land 25,000 pounds of lobsters over 2 years and so forth. So the trap allocations are really tight in the case of some of the offshore boats. And if you do this, then what happens when a scalloper comes along and clips the end of a trawl and takes 15 or 20 pots? There's no mechanism other than catastrophic loss for them to get those tags back. So I actually came to the meeting more in the mindset of supporting cutting the percent down from 10% to say 3% to move in the right direction, but also to recognize that to try to lessen the burden on people like Pat and his staff. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So just quickly back to Mike Pentney's comments, it sounds like, to sort of define what, triggers that is something that will be dealt with after the meeting. So just getting that recorded into the meeting proceedings here so that we do in fact follow up on that is good. And David, go ahead, David.
I'd just like to pursue the response Dan gave. I appreciate the response, but we all have to factor in, we got other areas. We got area 4, area 5, area 2. And I know for a fact there are lots of multi-area boats. So we have to factor those considerations into any of this. I think this is only applying to 3, but we have 2-3 boats, right? And if an area 2 boat can get 10% and an area 3 boat can't get 0, how are we going to handle that?
I do not have an answer to that. Any response, Dan, to David's questions?
David's right. In Massachusetts, we allow the area 2 fishermen to also order 10% additional tags because, like out of Cape, many of them are trap starved. They took a 50% cut in traps, so it's very similar. So he brings up a good point. I guess I don't have an answer to that.
Okay, David, one more time, and then I think we're gonna
and I apologize for my repeated dunks in the tank. My suggestion here, this is a more complex issue than I think we recognize, and it may make some sense to table this and just include consideration of this in a subsequent action. That's all. Thank you.
Tony or Bob?
Well, one, for all of our rules, when we have 2 different rules, the most restrictive rule applies if you're fishing in multiple areas. So that could apply if, I mean, if someone were to ask me what I would have said to you, I would have said the most restrictive. But if it's the board's intent to not move forward with this, then you would just not, you would vote this down and it would be status quo. You wouldn't have to table it.
Okay, so we will take the vote on this, and depending on the way the board feels about it, it can be voted up or down. Go ahead, David.
I had somebody whispering in my ear that the other way to solve this to exempt area 3 in the same motion. So I think you have provided this guidance, Mr. Chairman. You don't want motions to amend. You want to deal with one motion at a time. Is that correct? We have a motion to amend on the floor.
Right. So if we were to move on this motion, what you're thinking about, we could make a subsequent amendment to the main motion. Is that, would that work?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Okay. So we have a motion to amend here. Let's dispense with that motion So I'm going to call the vote. All those in favor, please raise your hand.
Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey.
All those opposed?
No hands.
No hands. Any abstentions?
Rhode Island, NOAA Fisheries, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware.
Any no votes? Okay. All right, so the motion to amend passes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-0 with 4 abstentions. 5 abstentions. Thank you, Jeff. I should just stop giving the numbers and just look over at Jeff's hand signals. No null votes. Okay, so now we have a complete motion. I'll wait for that to get crafted up on the board here. Oh, I see, except for OCC, got it. Okay, so we have a main motion up on the board. Give folks a minute to take a look, and then David, anything to add here?
Could I request a 1-minute caucus?
Yes, let's do a 2-minute caucus.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, we have a motion in front of us. Is there anything further before we go ahead and vote on this motion? Pat.
I'm kind of in a bind because of what may come next here, but if there is a subsequent action, if this goes through, then everybody has to issue 800 minus Outer Cape Cod, right? The Outer Cape Cod would be exempt. But if there is a subsequent action to exempt another area or allow a small percentage, then we have an equity issue between LMA1 and any other area. So I'm very cautious. It's a fairness issue, right? Maine has done the right thing for years in a very administratively burdensome process. So if we're going to go in that direction and other areas are going to get a pass or to allow to do something different, then Maine should be given the same opportunity. So I'm just a little concerned about the direction we're going to go here.
Thank you, Pat. David.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. A question for Bob Beal or Tony, I guess. Do we have an option here of postponing this while we do what Pat wants us to do, which is get together and talk about it? In other words, we approve the addendum without this provision, but postpone this provision to a subsequent meeting. Thank you.
Well, you could approve this addendum without this and that would be it. If you wanted to then take this issue up, you'd have to initiate a new addendum. You could pause the consideration of this addendum right now and not approve anything today, try to sort something out here and bring that back at a subsequent meeting. You couldn't approve the addendum today, sort of hold this issue in a parking lot and then come back and make it part of an addendum that you approved today. So you either approve the addendum today without this, or you pause the whole thing and try it at a subsequent meeting.
Thanks for that, Bob. Dan?
Yes, I appreciate Pat's concerns, but the motion itself is even a little bit misleading because it talks about issuance of trap tags equal to harvested trap tag allocations, when the truth is we talk about trap tag allocations in an area that has an effort control plan. And so that's Outer Cape, Area 2, Area 3, et cetera. Really, Area 1 has a trap limit of 800. And I think Cherie and I are both sensitive to the concerns of Gulf of Maine Area 1 fishermen with the different standards on trap tag issuance. And I'd be certainly willing in Massachusetts, because the plan doesn't require us to issue an extra 10%, I'm certainly willing to constrain the area 1 fishermen to 800 tags and use a Maine-like standard, because when Maine didn't opt for the 10% extra tags, they did it on their own volition, and they were very successful. So we're kind of looking to kind of adopt that model in to some degree. But Area 3 and Outer Cape have trap limits that are license specific, and it's just really painful to squeeze down those last few trap tags out of the business, because if they lose or if they want to replace a trawl, it's nice having a few extra trap tags, but these are really trap starved areas. So I would ask that the board approve these, and it's my intention to adopt a Maine-like approach to Area 1.
Thank you, Dan. Any further discussion? Okay. All right, I think we're ready to call the question here. All those in favor of the motion up on the board, please raise your hand.
New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts.
All those opposed?
Rhode Island.
Abstentions?
Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and NOAA Fisheries.
No votes. None. Okay, I'm not going to say numbers until I see them up on the board here, but I'm fairly certain that the motion passed. Motion passed, 3 to approve, 1 opposed, with 7 abstentions and no nulls. Okay. All right. I believe that is it for issue 1. So I think we have now dealt with both issues in the addendum. So we're ready for a final motion to approve the addendum as modified today. Is anybody ready to make that motion? Tony?
Mr. Chair, in order to move us a little bit faster, we have suggested that you add an implementation date when you make that motion.
Okay, so when we make that motion, we'd like to also add an implementation date. So Cherie, did you want to make that motion? And if you would be so kind as to add the implementation date as well.
Yes, I'd like to move to approve Lobster Addendum 27 as modified today with an implementation date of January 1st, 2024.
Okay, we have a motion before us. Is there a second? I see Emerson with a second. Emerson Hasbrook. Okay, Cherie, anything you want to add as the maker of the motion?
So Dan, would that work for your rulemaking process? I mean, that's several months out.
Yes.
Thank you.
Anything else, Cherie, before?
No, I think that would be able to address everybody's concerns to actually have it implemented in time. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Cherie. Emerson, anything to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, but I'm going to defer my time to my co-commissioner here, Jim Gilmore.
Thank you, Emerson. Did I see another hand? Representative Peak.
Thank you. Just before we take a vote, I'll telegraph to the board that I don't know how the delegation will be voting, but inside our delegation, I will not be supporting this, not because I don't support conservation measures, but I feel that the economic impact and what we are asking the Outer Cape lobstermen to do in participating in this, I cannot support this motion, and the lack of support for seeking a compromise leads me to the unfortunate position, being somebody who I consider myself a conservationist, having to take a no vote for this particular motion.
Thank you, Representative. Jim Gilmore, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, and I'm not opposed to the motion. It's just, as my comments were earlier, we have to do this legislatively. So we will try to make that deadline, but I will just about guarantee you we're not going to make it. For, you know, again, our history with Jonah Craft took us 2 years to get that in. And secondly, we don't have a legislative commissioner right now to help us with our legislature. So we could have some challenges facing that. That being said, our fishery is extremely small. We have 9 permit holders left, and I think only 4 of them are actually fishing. So if that delay does occur, I don't think it's going to have a drastic impact on the resource. So just with that caveat, we'll be supporting the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, further discussion, Pat?
Just quickly, understanding Mr. Gilmore's issues on timing, I think the biggest issue from compliance is going to be gauge. So I think you have well beyond 2024 to deal with that issue. So
thanks for that clarification. Okay, I think, does anybody need time to caucus? Please raise your hand. We're way over time. Thank you for not raising your hand. Is there, you know, I did sort of promise I would go to the public. Is there anybody, we're kind of way over time, so I'm hoping there's no hands. Okay, no hands online. Thank you for that. So why don't we go ahead and call the question and get this done. So all those in favor of the motion to approve Lobster Addendum 27 as modified today with an implementation date of January 1st, 2024. All those in favor, please raise your hand.
Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, NOAA Fisheries, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia.
Any opposed?
Massachusetts.
Any abstentions? Any null votes? All right, the motion passes 10 to approve. Oh, good, I got that one. No time. 10 to approve, 1 opposed, no abstentions, no null votes. Great, thank you all very much. Good job. So we have a few agenda items left here. I think what we decided is we'll do the quick update on the tracker devices. We'll do a quick update on the Jonah crab assessment, but we are going to skip the conservation management team roles agenda item, and we'll address that at some other point. So with that, Tony, I'll turn it over to you for the update on the trackers.
I'm going to skip my slides and just quickly go through the trackers. So we are well on our way and moving forward with the trackers. Massachusetts has already gotten over 200 trackers on vessels. ACCSP is seeing those tracks in the database. Things have, I think, been going pretty smoothly along the way, so it's great news. 3 states have put in their implementation plans to NOAA Fisheries. 2 of them have been approved. Maine is the one that has not yet, but being under consideration, and we are working on the southern states. And if you see an email from me, please make sure that you respond either in the affirmative or the negative from the southern states so I can finalize that up. And we, just as an FYI for the trackers, the tracker work group is going to consider a new tracker in June. So we may have another device on board by the end of June. Any questions?
Questions for Tony? Seeing no one around the table. Anyone online with questions? Any hands raised? Nope. Okay, thank you, Tony. Appreciate that. Let's move on to an update from the Jonah Crab assessment. Whenever you're ready, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For a quick update on the current Jonah Crab stock assessment, the Jonah Crab stock assessment subcommittee met 2 weeks ago in New Bedford for the assessment workshop. We anticipate at least 2 more meetings, depending on how our next goes, which will be a SAS meeting to tie up some loose ends that remain from that stock assessment workshop. And then we will meet with the full technical committee in July to present and hopefully have the assessment approved by the technical committee for peer review. Our peer review is being planned currently for slightly later than what we originally had on our timeline of July. We're planning for late August, but we still are on track to present out the assessment and the peer review to the board at the annual meeting. And that's it for my update.
Thank you, Jeff. Questions for Jeff on the Jonah Crab stock assessment process? Not seeing any hands around the table. Any hands online? No hands online. All right. Thanks for that, Jeff. Appreciate it. So we, as I mentioned, we're going to skip the second to last agenda item, but we still have other business that was brought up at the beginning of the meeting. And so the first had to do with consultation with our Canadian counterparts. So Pat, I'll look to you to address that one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Caitlin does have a motion that I've prepared for this conversation. It was noted by several people, including Representative Peaks, around the issues of uncertainty with importation of lobster. Maine in particular has our own unique problem with the gray zone, where it's disputed waters around the border between Maine and Canada around Machias Seal Island, where we have roughly about 130 fishermen who, if the trigger is pulled and they're fishing under a smaller gauge or larger gauge at the minimum end, will be catching lobsters, throwing them back, and Canadian fishermen will be catching them and able to retain them, literally fishing right beside each other. So I think the time has come for us to address this this gauge issue directly with Canada. And I would move to request that the Interstate Fisheries Management Policy Board approve the creation of a subcommittee to engage Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans to discuss transboundary issues related to the importation of lobster as it relates to different minimum gauge sizes in the 2 countries. The subcommittee should be made up of 4 members of the Lobster Management Board who have license holders that fish in Area 1 and/or 3, and 1 representative from the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Commission's executive director or his designee.
Okay, thank you, Pat. We have a motion on the board. The motion seconded by David Borden. Pat, do you wish to offer anything else on the motion?
No, I think I was offered up all like up front. So I front loaded, Mr. Chairman, I front loaded.
Thank you, Pat. David, anything as the seconder?
Nothing to add other than the fact that these are fairly complicated issues, and I think we need to get on with the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Ray Kane.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I turn to Mike Patney. I've been told to understand these transboundary meetings are always difficult. So what are your thoughts on this, Mike?
It looks like Mr. Patney's consulting with legal counsel, so give him a minute. Mike, do you wish to answer Ray's question?
Could I ask the indulgence of the board to restate the question?
Yes, Mike, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand these transboundary discussions are always difficult. So can you give us your feed on this, your thoughts?
Yeah, they are difficult. And I was consulting with legal counsel because this motion, it's difficult to understand what the structure would be in terms of a normal bilateral government to government discussion between the U.S. and Canada. So, my inclination is to abstain on this and then discuss with our international affairs partners and Department of State to see what might be made of this motion should it pass. But it's, I wasn't prepared to fully comprehend and think through the implications of this. So I hope the board will understand that they don't have any kind of definitive answer for how this might work.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Representative Peak.
Of course, as a legislator, my bias is always in favor of legislation. I know that Maine has an active federal delegation, in particular your senators who care deeply about all of your fisheries that are there, but in particular the lobster fishery there. And I guess a question for you, Pat, is are they in the loop on this? And is this something that we should be speaking with our federal partners? Are my congressman, my two senators, other members of the congressional delegation from Massachusetts, to put this on their radar screen, so we have either as a negotiating stick that federal legislation is possible, or to more fully engage them in whatever this rulemaking process might be.
Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Representative. I think, the Maine delegation is very informed when it comes to the gray zone issues. Senator Collins in particular has met with the fishermen that fish the gray zone out of Cutler. She's not, I don't believe, been brought up to speed so much on the importation issues, but we'll certainly be having conversations with her on those. And here, I'm not thinking this is a federal legislation issue, right? This is going to have to be an agreement between the countries. But I look at this as kind of a who's on first, right? The Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Commission is the primary management, has the primary management responsibilities for American lobster, and not to cut out the agency, but the agency is also very involved with those direct country-to-country conversations. But we deal from a state of Maine perspective directly with DFO on issues of concern one-on-one. I believe that they would engage with us on this. The gray zone issue in particular won't get resolved unless the World Court steps in. But conversations around the inequities that are in place with them, around also if they understand, Canada understands that a volume of lobster that may not be able to come into the United States for processing would be significant. So I would think that alone would be something that they would want to discuss with us and how we could potentially rectify it in the long term.
Thank you.
Okay, any further discussion on this? All right, so, oh, sorry, Bob, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just want to follow up on Mike Pentney's comments, and by him and his agency 48 hours. I think, just remember this is going to go to the policy board for consideration. So I think, 2 days from now, maybe there can be a little bit more insight from NOAA Fisheries. And I know they probably can't fully analyze it and talk to State Department, all those other things, but we can see what we can do, and or they may have some more insight in the next on Wednesday.
Thanks for that, Bob. Okay, let's go ahead and call the question here. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. So I'm gonna go backwards here. Are there any objections to the motion? And I will call, are there any abstentions? One abstention. So the motion passes by consent. All right, so Pat, I've got one more from you, and that was on the interaction with the scallop fishery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be quick. The New England Fisheries Management Council is considering allowing scallop access on the northern edge of Georges Bank. At their April meeting, the council initiated the action and approved goals and objections for the action. Given the population of large female lobsters in this area, this action likely going to be interest to this board because of those interactions. I don't think we need to task the TC with anything at this point, but I wanted to put it on the board's radar screen. I think it's an important issue. The Lobster Board did provide comments at a previous action, the Omnibus Habitat Amendment 2 action. And that's when the scallop access to northern edge was considered in the past. So maybe we could just dust off those comments and then take this issue up at the next Lobster Management Board.
Tony, go ahead.
Just to let the board know, Michelle Bachman did reach out to Caitlin, and Caitlin has reached out to the TC. We've provided them the last report that we had, which is, I believe, from 2012. And then Burton gave us some new information that we'll work with Michelle to give her as well. So we did engage the TC some.
Okay, great. Great. Thanks for bringing that up, Pat. Okay, and do you need anything on that beyond? Go ahead.
Just one very quick issue. Just we've passed an addendum, addendum 27. We still obviously have pending whale rules. Mike Penny talked about it from a resiliency standpoint at the beginning, and I just want to, this probably goes without saying, but if we do see new whale rules before this trigger, before any triggers are pulled, or even in the interim between triggers, I think we as a board and the TC need to understand what the relationship to resiliency is, and we may need to revisit that issue, but I just wanted to put that on the record.
Thanks for that, Pat. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of our agenda. So can I get a motion to adjourn? A motion made by Ray, seconded by Dan McKiernan. I can't do that. Second by Mike Luisi. Any objections to adjourning? Seeing no hands, we are adjourned.